The smell of fresh-cut wood floated through the small workshop long before the sun had fully risen over the quiet town. Ernesto stood at his wooden bench, sleeves rolled to his elbows, carefully sanding the edge of a table leg. The steady rasp of sandpaper against oak filled the room, a familiar rhythm that had been part of his life for as long as he could remember. To most people in town, Ernesto was just the carpenter. The man who repaired broken chairs. The man who built dining tables. The man who worked quietly and went home quietly. Few people noticed anything more about him. His workshop was small but warm. Sunlight pushed through the dusty windows and landed on shelves stacked with chisels, clamps, and jars filled with screws and nails. In the corner sat a radio that only worked half the time, but Ernesto kept it anyway. When it did work, it played old songs that drifted softly around the shop. And whenever the music came on, something in Ernesto changed. His shoulders relaxed, his eyes softened. Sometimes, without even realizing it, he sang along. But he never sang loudly when people were around. Music was something he kept mostly to himself. Something private, something sacred. That morning, Ernesto worked slowly, carefully shaping the leg of a wooden rocking chair someone had ordered. The chair was meant for an elderly woman across town who had lost her husband the year before. Ernesto had spent days making sure every curve was perfect. He believed furniture should hold memories, not just bodies. As he worked, the radio crackled to life with a faint melody from an old ballad. Ernesto paused. His hand rested against the wood as the song filled the room. He listened quietly for a moment. Then he began to sing. At first it was barely more than a whisper. But gradually his voice grew stronger. It was warm and rich, carrying a depth that seemed impossible for such a quiet man. The sound filled the workshop, echoing softly off the wooden walls. If anyone had been outside the door, they might have stopped walking just to listen. But no one was there. And Ernesto liked it that way. He finished the song and smiled slightly, brushing wood dust from his hands. Singing always left him feeling lighter, as if something inside him had been allowed to breathe. A loud knock interrupted the peaceful moment. Ernesto wiped his hands on a rag and walked to the door. Standing outside was Mateo, the owner of the local cafe. Mateo was loud, cheerful, and almost impossible to ignore. "Morning, Ernesto," he said, stepping inside without waiting for permission. "Morning," Ernesto replied calmly. Mateo looked around the shop and whistled. "Still making the best furniture in town, I see." "I try," Ernesto said. Mateo walked over to the rocking chair and ran a hand along the smooth wood. "Beautiful. You make things like they're meant to last forever." Ernesto shrugged. "That's the idea." Mateo leaned against the workbench, watching him. "You know," Mateo said slowly, "the town festival is this weekend." Ernesto nodded. The festival happened every year in the town square. There were food stalls, music, games for kids, and a small stage where local performers entertained the crowd. "I know," Ernesto said. Mateo smiled mischievously. "They're still looking for one more singer." Ernesto froze slightly. Mateo continued, "I heard you singing the other day when I passed by your shop." Ernesto looked away immediately. "You must have heard the radio." Mateo laughed. "Don't do that. That wasn't the radio." Ernesto said nothing. Mateo stepped closer. "You should sing at the festival." The words hung in the air like a challenge Ernesto wasn't ready to face. "No," he said quietly. Mateo raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" Ernesto went back to sanding the chair leg. "I build furniture. That's enough." Mateo watched him for a moment. "You've got something special in that voice," he said softly. "People should hear it." Ernesto kept sanding. "I'm not a performer." Mateo sighed. "Think about it," he said, heading toward the door. "Sometimes people are meant to do more than one thing." Then he left. The workshop fell quiet again, but Ernesto's mind wasn't quiet anymore. He tried to focus on his work, but Mateo's words kept echoing in his head. "You've got something special in that voice." Ernesto had heard those words before. Years ago. From someone who had believed in him more than anyone else. His mother. She used to sit in the kitchen while he sang as a boy, her eyes shining with pride. "Your voice tells stories," she would say. But after she passed away, Ernesto stopped sharing that part of himself with the world. It was easier to keep it hidden. Safer. By evening, the rocking chair was finished. Ernesto carried it outside to admire it in the fading sunlight. The wood glowed warmly, every curve smooth and balanced. He ran his hand along the armrest and sighed. Across town, workers were already setting up the festival stage. Lights were being hung, speakers tested, and colorful banners stretched between poles. Music drifted faintly through the air. Ernesto watched from a distance. Then he quietly went home. The night before the festival arrived faster than he expected. The town square buzzed with excitement. Food stands lined the streets, children ran between booths, and the stage lights cast golden beams across the crowd. Ernesto hadn't planned to attend. But somehow, his feet brought him there anyway. He stood near the back of the crowd, hands in his jacket pockets. Several performers had already taken the stage. A group of teenagers played energetic songs on guitars. A local choir sang a cheerful tune. The crowd clapped and laughed and cheered. Ernesto watched silently. Then he heard a familiar voice. "Hey." Mateo appeared beside him, grinning. "I was hoping you'd come." "I'm just watching," Ernesto said. Mateo nodded. "Still time to change your mind." Ernesto shook his head. "No." But as he spoke, his eyes drifted toward the stage. One more singer was announced. But no one came forward. The organizer looked around nervously. Mateo glanced at Ernesto. Then he did something unexpected. He raised his hand. "I know someone," he called. Ernesto's heart nearly stopped. Mateo grabbed his arm gently. "Trust me," he whispered. Before Ernesto could protest, Mateo was guiding him toward the stage. The crowd barely noticed at first. To them, he looked like any other man. Simple clothes, calloused hands, a carpenter. Ernesto stepped onto the stage slowly. The lights felt bright and unfamiliar. A microphone waited in the center. He stood there, unsure what to do. The crowd quieted slightly. Some people looked curious, others barely paid attention. Ernesto took a breath. For a moment, he considered walking away. But then he remembered his mother's voice. "Your voice tells stories." He closed his eyes, and he began to sing. The first note was soft. So soft that people leaned forward to hear it. Then the second note came. Stronger, richer. Within seconds, the entire square grew quiet. Conversations stopped. Children paused. Even the food vendors turned their heads. Ernesto's voice filled the night air like a warm wind carrying emotion through every corner of the square. It wasn't just singing. It was storytelling. Every note carried something real. Something honest. The crowd listened in stunned silence. The judges sitting near the stage exchanged surprised glances. No one had expected this. Not from a quiet carpenter. Not from a man who looked like he had just stepped out of a woodshop. But as Ernesto sang, the difference between carpenter and performer disappeared. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply sharing something that had lived inside him for years. And people felt it. A woman in the front row wiped tears from her eyes. A man standing near the food stalls stopped serving customers just to listen. Mateo stood near the stage, smiling proudly. He had known this moment would come. Ernesto reached the final verse of the song. His voice rose gently, powerful yet controlled, carrying emotion that seemed to wrap around the crowd like an invisible embrace. The last note lingered in the air for a long moment. Then silence followed. Not awkward silence, but the kind that comes when people are too moved to react immediately. Then someone clapped. One clap became two. Two became 10. Within seconds, the entire square erupted in applause. People stood. Some whistled. Others cheered loudly. Ernesto looked stunned. He had spent most of his life believing his voice belonged only inside a workshop. But tonight it had filled an entire town square. He stepped away from the microphone slowly. The applause continued. Mateo rushed onto the stage and wrapped him in a quick hug. "I told you," Mateo said with a grin. Ernesto laughed softly, shaking his head in disbelief. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. Pride. Not the loud kind, but the quiet kind. The kind that grows when you finally let the world see who you truly are. The next morning, Ernesto returned to his workshop as usual. The smell of fresh wood greeted him like an old friend. He picked up his tools and began working on a new table. But something was different. When the radio crackled to life and music filled the room, Ernesto didn't lower his voice anymore. He sang freely. And this time, When people passed by outside the shop, they stopped to listen. Because they knew something now. The quiet carpenter who built beautiful furniture by day had another gift. One that could build moments people would never forget.